It was the kind of news no one ever expected. For decades, Mark Harmon had been a staple of American television, known for his calm demeanor, iconic roles, and an off-screen life that appeared nothing less than pristine. But on that day, as cameras flashed and voices murmured in disbelief, the image of the man we thought we knew began to crumble. Mark Harmon, sentenced. The words echoed across every news outlet, every fan forum, and every social media feed. No one could quite believe it. What had gone so wrong? Long before courtrooms and controversy, Mark Harmon had been beloved as Leroy Jethro Gibbs on the hit series NCIS. His steady presence, stern face, and moral compass made him one of television's most trusted characters. But Harmon's influence extended far beyond just one show. With a career spanning nearly 5 decades, he had become part of the fabric of Hollywood, admired not just for his performances, but for the man people assumed he was behind the scenes, disciplined, private, and drama-free. So when reports started surfacing of legal troubles, most brushed them off as either rumor or some misunderstanding. But whispers have a way of growing louder. The industry was abuzz with questions. Why had Harmon suddenly retreated from public life? Why did former co-stars suddenly grow quiet when asked about him? And why, after years of adoration, was there a sudden cloud looming over his legacy? The first real shock came during an offhand interview with a former NCIS crew member. It wasn't a tell-all. It wasn't even a planned discussion. But a comment slipped out. A suggestion that not everything on set had been as professional as it seemed. At first, the internet speculated it was about general behind-the-scenes tension. After all, long-running shows often face internal friction. But then came the documents. Quietly unsealed court files, showing the beginning of a very different story, one filled with lawsuits, hidden settlements, and alleged misconduct spanning years. The headlines began to change tone. Mark Harmon under investigation was the first major one. People wanted answers. The once private actor suddenly found himself at the center of media attention in a way he had never experienced before. Not for a role, not for a red carpet appearance, but for something far darker. Legal analysts began weighing in. Fans divided themselves between disbelief and disappointment. And the truth, as it turned out, was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. According to court records, the charges against Harmon weren't singular. They were cumulative, spanning financial mismanagement, contractual violations, and even allegations tied to on-set behavior that, if proven true, would tarnish not just his reputation but the legacy of the shows he had worked on. What seemed at first like career rumors were now part of a growing legal case, one that had enough traction to move forward publicly. The prosecution's argument was built carefully, presenting years of documentation, witness statements, and confidential records. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence came from a former executive producer who alleged that Harmon had knowingly used his influence to suppress internal complaints and shift blame to junior staff. That testimony sent shockwaves through the courtroom and through the entertainment world. As the trial proceeded, Harmon remained composed, appearing in court in a simple black suit, flanked by a small legal team. He offered no dramatic displays, no long statements. Just silence. It was that silence that bothered people most. Fans wanted explanations. The industry wanted accountability. And yet, Harmon stuck to the quiet discipline that had once earned him admiration, but now only deepened the mystery. Day by day, the courtroom filled with more reporters. The gallery was packed, not just with journalists, but with former coworkers, producers, and even distant relatives. Everyone wanted to witness what was being called the fall of an icon. The prosecution laid out its case meticulously, but the defense tried to counter every claim with questions of context, of reliability, of motive. They argued that Harmon had become a scapegoat, that decades in the public eye had made him an easy target for resentment, exaggeration, and revenge. But the evidence was hard to ignore. Bank transfers tied to unapproved expenses. Emails referencing staff dismissals that bypassed protocol. Internal complaints that never saw the light of day. A pattern was beginning to form, one that suggested control, concealment, and perhaps even coercion. The media frenzy intensified when Polly Parrott, Harmon's former co-star, was called to testify. Her departure from NCIS years earlier had already been shrouded in rumors, and now, on the stand, she spoke in clear, deliberate terms. She didn't lash out, but her words carried weight. She talked about an environment of fear, of unresolved conflict, and of a man who once inspired but eventually intimidated. Her testimony wasn't the sole reason the jury leaned toward conviction, but it was certainly a turning point. The verdict didn't come suddenly. After weeks of trial and days of jury deliberation, the moment finally arrived. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Social media went into overdrive. And when the words were read, guilty on multiple counts, the world seemed to pause. Mark Harmon, once a paragon of television virtue, was now sentenced. The judge's words were firm, his tone unwavering. The sentence itself wasn't just about punishment. It was about making a statement that no amount of fame or legacy could place someone above accountability. Harmon was sentenced to 5 years, with eligibility for parole after 3, but the legal consequences were only part of the story. Because what followed was a wave of fallout that would reshape everything around him. His shows, his fan base, his professional connections, and even how we remember the roles he once played. The entertainment industry reacted swiftly. Networks issued carefully worded statements, distancing themselves from the controversy while still acknowledging Harmon's past contributions. Syndicated reruns of NCIS began disappearing from certain channels. Contracts were reviewed. Production houses reassessed their internal protocols. It was more than just one man's fall. It triggered a broader reckoning, especially for long-running shows where the power dynamics between stars and production staff had often gone unquestioned for years. For longtime fans, the emotional impact was devastating. Some clung to disbelief, hoping that an appeal might overturn the ruling or that new evidence would emerge to cast doubt on the conviction. Others felt betrayed, wondering how they had spent years admiring someone who, behind closed doors, may have allowed darker behaviors to flourish. Fan forums that once overflowed with trivia and admiration now buzzed with arguments, theories, and grief. And quietly, across the internet, tribute videos began disappearing. Blogs were archived. The digital footprint of Mark Harmon slowly began to fade. But the most powerful response came not from the networks or the courts, but from those who had worked alongside him, many of whom were now speaking publicly for the first time. Directors, assistant producers, costume designers, stunt coordinators, people whose names had rarely been known beyond the end credits. Their testimonies painted a nuanced portrait of Harmon, not as a villain, but as a man who had once inspired loyalty, only to grow distant, rigid, and ultimately dismissive of voices that dared question him. Some described a man trapped by his own image. After years of playing characters with unshakable moral codes, Harmon had perhaps internalized the belief that he could do no wrong. Others noted how the pressures of fame and creative control seemed to harden him over time. According to them, the Mark Harmon of the early 2000s was very different from the one who stood on set a decade later, less approachable, more demanding, and increasingly insulated from criticism. Meanwhile, inside the prison walls where Harmon began serving his sentence, there were no special privileges. The world outside might have known him as a Hollywood legend, but inside he was just another inmate. His first days were reportedly quiet. No visitors. No media interviews. He declined all press inquiries and issued no public apology. Perhaps he was waiting for the appeals process, or perhaps he had accepted the reality he now faced. Speculation about a tell-all memoir began swirling almost immediately. Publishers were rumored to be offering lucrative deals. Some claimed Harmon was already jotting down his thoughts, not as a defense, but as an account of how a career that once sparkled had unraveled so publicly. Still, no official word came from his team. No book. No statement. Just silence. In Hollywood, time moves quickly. New stars emerge, new scandals dominate the headlines. But some stories linger, etched into the cultural memory by their sheer contrast, how someone so beloved could fall so far. Mark Harmon's story became a cautionary tale, one that producers and actors alike cited when discussing the need for transparency, accountability, and ethical leadership behind the scenes. And yet, for every person who turned their back on Harmon's legacy, there were those who continued to defend him. Former castmates who remembered moments of mentorship. Fans who felt the legal system had overreached. Even fellow actors who, though silent during the trial, later hinted in interviews that the full truth may never be known. These voices weren't loud, but they persisted, reminding the world that stories are rarely black and white. What made the entire saga even more complex was Harmon's refusal to fight back in the media. No interviews. No rebuttals. No dramatic outbursts. Just a man who, after decades of commanding the spotlight, now chose to retreat into the shadows. Whether it was out of guilt, strategy, or exhaustion, no one could say for sure. But the absence of his voice left a void, one that people rushed to fill with opinions, assumptions, and conjecture. As months passed, the entertainment world slowly adjusted. New actors stepped into lead roles once thought inseparable from Harmon's legacy. NCIS continued in some international markets with disclaimers. Spin-offs emerged with entirely fresh casts. A new generation of viewers, many unaware of the show's complicated past, began rediscovering it through streaming platforms, often unaware that the face they saw leading each episode had become one of the industry's most controversial figures. For the people who had worked with Harmon, the sentence offered a strange kind of closure. Some felt justice had finally been served. Others still wrestled with conflicting memories, of good moments, of generosity, of leadership that had once uplifted them. Human beings are complex, and Harmon, despite the trial, remained just that, a man with flaws, with strengths, with decisions that led to a fall he may never recover from. Behind the scenes, efforts were made to reconcile the damage. Some of the individuals who had come forward during the trial used their platform to push for better protection for crew members on long-running shows. Advocacy groups emerged to support whistleblowers in the entertainment industry. And for the first time, the illusion that a spotless reputation could be a substitute for real accountability was thoroughly shattered. Still, the question that lingered wasn't just what Mark Harmon had done, but why. How had someone with so much to lose, with such a respected position in the industry, allowed things to spiral out of control? Some pointed to ego, others to fear, and some to the simple truth that unchecked power, no matter how well earned, can become dangerous when left unchallenged. Years after his sentencing, Mark Harmon's name still triggers strong reactions. Documentaries were proposed. Podcasts dissected the case from every angle. College media classes began using his story as a case study in the rise and fall of celebrity personas. Some called it a tragedy. Others called it justice. But no one could ignore it. He had once been a household name, an American icon, the face of justice on TV. Now, he was a cautionary footnote in Hollywood history. His image no longer adorned posters or DVD box sets. His legacy, once clear, was now complicated, debated, and deeply fractured. And as the world moved on, so did the people who once knew him best, carrying with them stories, memories, and unresolved emotions about the man who, for better or worse, had left an indelible mark on their lives. Years passed, and the media cycle shifted to newer stars, fresher controversies, and modern cultural battles. Yet, like a ghost, Mark Harmon's story would re-emerge now and then, on anniversaries of his sentencing, during retrospectives of NCIS, or when someone involved in the original show gave a cryptic quote or made an emotional reflection. Each resurgence reopened old debates, reigniting arguments about guilt, redemption, and the limits of personal legacy. Inside the prison where Harmon served his sentence, his life remained quiet. Those who worked at the facility described him as reserved, polite, even distant. He kept mostly to himself, reading, sometimes writing, occasionally participating in counseling programs. His celebrity status, though acknowledged, didn't shield him from the daily routines and responsibilities of incarceration. If anything, it made his isolation more complete. Inmates recognized him, sure, but they weren't fans. They were men with their own stories, their own regrets. To them, Harmon wasn't Gibbs. He was just another man doing time. His legal team filed for parole at the earliest opportunity, and in a move that stunned some and satisfied others, the board granted it. Harmon was released after serving just over 3 years, under strict conditions. There was no press conference, no interviews, no eager crowd awaiting his freedom. He exited quietly through the back of the facility, face hidden by sunglasses and a plain cap, vanishing into a world that had long since moved on. Post-release, he didn't return to Los Angeles or make any attempt at a public comeback. Instead, he was spotted briefly in a small coastal town, far from Hollywood, living in a modest home near the sea. Neighbors described him as quiet, rarely seen, and always alone. The man who once stood beneath the bright lights of sound stages now watched sunsets from a porch no one photographed. For the first time in decades, he was anonymous, and maybe that's what he wanted all along. Occasionally, tabloids would publish grainy photos with headlines like, "Mark Harmon, where is he now?" But these stories faded fast. There was no scandal to chase anymore, no dramatic turn of events to report. His story had ended not with a bang, but with silence, leaving the world to speculate on what he thought, how he felt, and whether he ever regretted it all. In Hollywood, forgiveness is a strange currency. Some stars bounce back after public disgrace, repackaging themselves for a second act. Others disappear entirely, remembered only through the lens of the scandal that defined their fall. Harmon belonged to the latter. He never tried to revive his career, never sat for a tell-all, never appeared at industry events or spoke about the trial. In an era driven by confession and apology tours, his silence was both unsettling and oddly consistent. He had always been a private man. Even in disgrace, he stayed true to that. The legacy of NCIS was forever altered. While the show continued in some iterations, reboots and spin-offs distanced themselves from the original storylines, avoiding any mention of Gibbs or Harmon. Fans who rewatched the early seasons did so with a strange mix of nostalgia and discomfort, reminded at every scene of what had once been and what had come after. Younger fans who discovered the series years later often did so without knowledge of the controversy. For them, Gibbs was just a character, a fictional figure from a bygone era of network television. But for those who lived through the rise and fall, each episode felt like a time capsule, a reminder of how quickly admiration could turn into reckoning. What remained, in the end, was the silence. The unanswered questions. The absence of closure. Harmon never defended himself publicly, never apologized, never tried to reshape the narrative. Whether this was due to guilt, shame, or simply exhaustion, no one knows. His silence became the final chapter, an unfinished, ambiguous ending to a story that had captivated millions. And maybe that's the part that still stings. Not just the crimes or the conviction, but the fact that a man so deeply admired for his sense of justice, integrity, and leadership had left without saying goodbye. No final words. No attempt to heal the wounds. Just silence, as if his exit had been scripted by someone else entirely. In that silence, the world was left to wrestle with its own contradictions, how someone could be both inspiring and disappointing, a symbol of justice on screen and a subject of judgment off it. The fall of Mark Harmon wasn't just about one man's missteps, it was a mirror held up to an industry and a society that often confuses image with identity, fiction with truth. And so, as the years stretch on, the memory of Mark Harmon fades not in a blaze of headlines or dramatic interviews, but in the quiet realization that even the brightest stars can dim without warning. The man who once commanded a nation's attention now lives in obscurity, a living reminder that fame is fragile, trust is priceless, and legacies are never truly secure. Goodbye, Mark Harmon. Not the character. Not the icon. The man. The one we thought we knew, the one who said nothing as the curtain fell. Goodbye forever.